We are in the room where it happens, quite literally. We are talking about high-profile cyber attacks and scam prevention. So I want to thank our moderator, Jonathan Perkinson. Sorry, it's the last session of the day already. Jonathan Perkinson, Partner and Risk Advisory at Ashurst. So he's going to be our moderator and he will introduce the panel. If we could have a round of applause for our panel just to welcome them. Get them excited about our last one.
Thanks, Lucinda, and good afternoon, everyone. We have a topic today that I think is going to be equal parts interesting, important, and maybe even scary, but talking about the intersection of cyber and scams. And could not think of three better people to kind of share the stage with as subject matter experts and thought leaders in the space. So maybe by way of quick introduction, I'll start with Andrew Davies. So Andrew is the Global Head of Financial Crime Compliance Strategy at Comply Advantage. We had the chance to sit together at dinner last night, and Comply Advantage is doing some really remarkable things, introducing AI into the customer journey and really generating some very high quality alerts that help people identify financial crime risk and scam risk. We also have Melanie Hayden. Melanie is the Managing Director of TrueU. I've actually downloaded just recently the TrueU app. It's incredibly powerful to have something in the palm of your hand that can give you an immediate warning and alert if your ID is potentially compromised, or if you have a message coming through that's potentially scam content, having that alert right there in your hand right away. It's remarkable, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. And then last we have Ethan Tees. So Ethan is the Executive General Manager of Payments at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. I've really admired CommBank for being a pioneer in this space for many, many years. And the ability for the bank to take its industrial scale and turn that into customer protection through different products and capabilities has been quite impressive. But for this audience as well, the ability to democratize some of that and offer it to the fintech sector so that every organization can give their customers the same protection as the CommBank is quite impressive as well. So really excited to have the topic here today. We'll jump right into it, and maybe, Ethan, a question that we'll start with you on. The topic today is exploring the intersection of cyber and scams. I've been in rooms like this for a number of years, and every time you talk about cyber, it tends to be a bit of a game of cat and mouse. So the criminals are getting more sophisticated, they're getting better tools, they're just continuing to innovate their game, and we're struggling from a cyber standpoint to catch up and to keep up. And so one of the questions that you ask about scams is, are we here going to be talking about the same thing, playing catch up every year with scams, or is there a way to actually outpace the threats? And so maybe each one of us on stage is going to have some very different perspectives, but would love your perspective on how does cyber risk and scam threats interact with one another, and more importantly, what are the things that your organization is doing to outpace that capability? And Ethan, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, that's good. Can you all hear me? And thanks for bringing excellent energy to the room. I mean, I have to say on scams and on cyber, this is a very dynamic space. The relationship is really clear that this is about financial crime, and there are different legs of the financial crime ecosystem. But we've experienced here in Australia a big lift in the scams exposure as real-time payments came to life. And I think that we've got this awesome asset in the NPP that has brought a lot of great benefit, but it also brought speed to the system. And so that meant that we had we had like a step change in the environment, and so a much harder fight to fight. Now, the good news is that, like, we've seen this in a lot of markets, but in Australia, I think the response has been stronger. And I think that comes through in the ecosystem approach that we have across the board, but also some of the innovation we've been able to bring. So if we look at how we do scam prevention in a real-time environment, at CBA, the first thing we think about is balance. And I remember when I took this job back in 2021 and things were starting to heat up, I would introduce myself as the EGM payments, and people would immediately say, why do you keep stopping my real-time payments, right? And that just illustrates the balance where, we have to find this right level of friction and right level of feature to make sure that we've got safety in payments. And so one of the things we did was we had at CBA, we could see 40% of the payments in Australia, and so we developed technology called NameCheck, which really just helped to front run what's been brought to bear in the industry now, which is confirmation of payee. And what that means is that customers know who they're paying, because we found that like one of the big things in scams is there's always deceit. And one of the big pieces of deceit is, are you paying the person you think that you're paying? And so NameCheck's been really successful. We've saved over 880 million in kind of these kind of misdirected payments since inception, about 470 million last year. And as you alluded to, the two big developments we've had since we started were like number one with confirmation of payee, which we're now live on. I think means that we've got NameCheck and COP together, much better for the Australian consumer and the participants. And then number two, we've exposed our NameCheck API to other FIs, to fraud detection companies, and even overseas. And I don't have the exact numbers to hand, but we're running quickly towards 100 million saved there. And that's been a huge benefit in scam prevention, but also in mistaken payment prevention. So we're taking costs out of the system as well. That's just one example. The thing that I think about in the core at CBA is, as you mentioned, we have scale. And in that, as we innovate, we have to do it with conviction. So when we put in biometric security throughout our app, the lift that we've got to do at CBA is really material. So we want to chase solutions that are going to work, and we need to make sure that we can roll them out with conviction. That's one of the big things we're looking at. As I look to the future, one of the areas that's going to be next is agentic interaction and agentic commerce. So we're already seeing, some of the tracks being laid for agentic commerce, which is going to be really cool and interesting for all consumers and businesses, but at the same time will bring new threat vectors. So I do think this is going to be a new thing to chase, is how do we keep that safe as well. And hopefully the learnings we've had over the past couple of years will be able to move faster.
Mel?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, a lot to unpack. It's a huge space. We're certainly up for the challenge, I think is where I would sort of start there. We're seeing and hearing a lot, especially on days like today, about AI, and we are seeing with the AI that scammers can get smarter, but I think we also know that AI can be a really good frontier for us as we move to scam protection. Real time, something that comes up often in payments. It's something that, especially with AI, comes up as a consumer demand for everything in our day-to-day lives. I think that with AI, we've got now real-time decisioning, detections, forecasts, and this really grounded for us the technology and the thinking for our new scam checker tool. So what we've built is a tool that picks up whether a scam message is likely to be a scam based on a bunch of known factors. So this is a new product. We released it about a month ago. You're probably all more familiar with the technology and the customer experience behind NameCheck, where you put in a bank account that you want to transfer to, and CBA tells you whether or not that bank account has been picked up before. This is similar with AI underpinning the technology. We run it against a known list of scam factors and tell you whether the message is likely to be a scam. So we're picking up scams at the top of the funnel. Great tool for consumers and families, and we're learning a lot throughout the forecasting that we can get from the technology, which we're looking forward to bringing as we think about future kind of products in that space. The other sort of angle that I think is where we're really working to pick up fraud earlier in the process, if we look at the flip of that, is in a tool that we've delivered at the core of the TrueU platform, which is an app available for all Australians. What it does, and I can't really describe it much better than JP did earlier, thank you for the free sort of pitch there. It's a tool that can live in the palm of your hands, where we alert you in real time when your identity is being used. So what that means is you go to Telstra, you give them your driver's license, they hand it back to you. What they're saying is, yes, Melanie Hayden that is a real license for Melanie Hayden. What we are doing is pinging that through to you in the moment to say, hey, Melanie Hayden, is this actually you? What we're picking up through this is more cases of identity fraud. There were already a lot. There were 250,000 last year alone. We're picking up more of them because in some of these cases people would never find out. And we're picking them up earlier in the process by getting them at the start of the funnel before the credit checks. So a lot that we're seeing and learning in this space as we move from being reactive to really proactive for our customers and get to the top of the funnel.
Wow. Okay, I made some notes, but I'm going to completely improvise based on the comments from my panelists, who were super impressive. I really liked what Ethan had mentioned about the sort of evolution of real-time payments in Australia. So if you think about when we introduced the MPP in Australia, there was we were already thinking about what was the impact of the creation of the MPP and real-time payments on fraud. One of the reasons for that is when we introduced real-time payments on the faster payment rails in the UK in 2007, what do you think happened? No one thought about fraud. There was a 135% increase in fraud when we introduced faster payments. The vision, and of course the banks here were thinking about that, and they put in the necessary protections, really on a bank-by-bank basis. The notion of a fraud overlay service wasn't fully realised, which is, in my opinion, a sort of bit of a shame. It's being fully realised, by the way, right now with the RTR rails in Canada and the use of a centralised fraud service by Intersekt, which I think is sort of great progress. I also liked Ethan's point about scale. Right, one of the things that certainly the large banks and we collectively as an industry, when you galvanise the energy that's at an event like this, is you basically bring together that scale to try and fight these sort of attacks. And we talked about cyber, we're talking about scams. In the prior session, for those of you that sat in on that, we talked about AML as well. Well, what we should be talking about is the lingua franca of this industry, and that is financial crime more broadly. So, we had this notion of fraud and AML, which was sort of characterized by this sort of term FRAML. Well, we're beyond FRAML at this point, right? 1 in 5 people are subject to fraud. Only 1 in 5 incidents of human slavery in Australia, which of course is a predicate crime for money laundering, are actually reported to the AFP. So we need to think about it more broadly. The scale that Ethan mentions that CBA have, but also the industry has, it means that we have more data to fight financial crime more effectively. And Melanie mentioned sort of identity theft and synthetic identities. According to the FBI, that's the fastest growing fraud, particularly in the United States, but really on a global basis. And that first line of defense in fighting synthetic identity fraud is managing the sort of identity, right? Identifying who you're doing business with and making sure that any activity is being conducted legitimately by you. So that's the first line of defense. And of course, beyond that, we need to look at that sort of scale that Ethan mentioned and look at the behavior collectively over time to try and find deviations that could be indicative of someone being a vulnerable individual and being sort of scammed. One of the things that I do at Comply Advantage is basically sort of talk about how data and technology can be used as as we sort of face this inflection point in the industry where we have more data and we can use that data to make better inference. Now that of course requires us to sort of do things like share data or at least share insights that are derived from data for us to be more effective in fighting financial crime. Everybody in the world generates around 1.7 megabytes of data every second, and that's sort of average across even people that have limited access to things like the internet. There's amazing quantity of data. That data is our main fuel that can drive us being more effective in fighting financial crime broadly.
There's an interesting thematic that kind of emerges through that conversation, and I think of the cyber concept of defense in depth, which is to say, different capabilities individually, they're fallible, but as you increase the depth and the density of them, they really work complementary in tandem with one another. And so if you think about kind of the true you proposition, it's really working to identify a risk before it even manifests itself into a potential scam or transaction. If you think about confirmation of payee, for example, that's at the moment of the transaction. You have that opportunity to use a piece of information and to spot it. And then when you have these things coming together, there's a portfolio effect as well. So I think that was a really nice kind of tie-in and different angles to approaching the same kind of harm and risk that we're all working to address. We'll move to a second question, and it strikes me that in this room we'll have a combination of fintechs and we'll have a combination of established financial institutions. And not everyone in the room is going to have the same squillion-dollar budget that Ethan probably gets to fight scams and cyber risk. And so, what would be your advice to folks in the room that might be sitting at different sizes of the value chain and different phases of their maturity around, where do you get started and how do you do what's best to protect your customers with the pragmatic constraints all around that we all have to deal with? And Andrew, maybe for this one, we'll start with you.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is, I would use sort of what's referred to as a yogiism. I would say it's the same, only different. And the first thing I would say is security and integrity, particularly as it relates to fraud and other crimes like money laundering, they need to be synonymous with your brand. Right, whether you're a fintech or whether you're a financial institution. I know I'd had a dinner last night and I sort of talked about this idea that people are quite nimble in how they're acquiring financial services. Now, the sort of jokey quote I use, and this is actually from an article in the Times in London from a couple of years ago, people of my generation are more likely to change their spouse than their banking relationship. Now that's not the same with millennials and people that are really your sort of target demographic. So security and integrity, and particularly fighting fraud, needs to be synonymous with your brand. And I often have this sort of discussion with established financial institutions, and I have this notion of a maturity curve, how you can navigate this maturity curve so you can fully realize the benefits of more advanced inference techniques, technology like Melanie's technology here to make it, to protect your customers. And of course, there's a sort of an inertia that you have as a larger established financial institution where you've got a lot of infrastructure. You may have different silo detection capabilities that you've acquired over time, different inorganic growth that that has led to the sort of acquisition of different technology. So I often talk about sort of aggregating to get a holistic view of the customer and of risk, sort of aggregating that type of technology into a sort of common alert and case management capability. I'm often talking about that. Large global organizations like JPMC, so Chase or Citi, they've sort of adopted that sort of approach as they're sort of trying to fight financial crime across their enterprise. And of course, that's a sort of notion of progressive renovation. That's a first step, but then you can sort of renovate the sort of inference engines to fight different types of scams and fraud. For fintechs, I sort of like try and talk about this and really sort of build it from the ground up, right? Generally, these fintechs, and I did talk about this at lunch, what is a fintech? Prior to working at Comply, I worked at Fiserv, which is an established sort of organization. Well, they rebranded themselves as the world's largest fintech. And then I did some work for ING Bank, and the CEO said, we're not a bank anymore, we're a fintech. So it depends on what you're sort of defining a fintech to be. But a lot of fintechs are very nimble, they're very tech savvy, they're able to sort of build all these protections into their technology stack from the start. And I definitely advocate that they do that. To come back to that original point about security and integrity and fraud prevention it's table stakes. It needs to be synonymous with your brand to protect your customers, protect your organization and the financial system itself.
Melanie, you'd have a unique perspective both as a startup, but as a startup working to protect customers from harm, but also ingesting customer information that could be harmful in the wrong circumstances. So how do you think about it as a startup?
Yeah, well, I love what you've said there, Andrew, on really starting with you are in such a powerful position being able to start and build from the ground up. And if I speak to my experience and be very glass half full on it, then that has been exactly that experience. When you start to build from the ground up, you have the opportunity to build in embedded scam protection and identity fraud tools for your customers, but you also do think about the employee experience and the experience of the build in a bit of a different way, I think, than when you're operating from those legacy systems. So I see that as a huge advantage. In TrueU, we shipped the product in about 4 months from, obviously there was a lot of work to come up with a solution that would solve what we believed and really believe now from the data is a real customer problem. The actual build itself can be quite quickly. So it's a real combination of thin slicing with what is the fastest scope to get to market and get something out the door with what are those tools that others really need. The other part of the answer, I think, is working together. And we do as much as we can, love to do more with many of you in the room on really sharing insights across the ecosystem, working with government, with industry, as well as really hearing from our customers, testing and learning based on their experiences, sometimes on single-digit customer experiences. We'll make changes if we really believe that they can be impactful. And I think then once we're working together as an ecosystem, and this sort of picks up a bit of a thread, JP, that I think you were getting to before, if we don't, I suppose the flip of that is that fragmentation then leaves gaps that criminals in our space can exploit, or gaps that in a less scary sense, no one is sort of solving for. If we work together, then those gaps don't exist. You know, it allows us to bring together all of the pieces of the pie, all of the slices of the pizza, and actually work out who's solving for what and where we can leverage from advantages of those things that have been already built with where are the real problems with, okay, well, someone's scanning a license out the back and going through the correct system, but there's actually a gap here with asking the consumer, hey, are you really who you say you are? I think the more that we share those insights, the more that we'll actually tease out those other problems.
Ethan, would love your perspective too, and you know, Combank, both, you know, the parent of X15 Ventures, you kind of get your exposure to that startup world, but you're probably also working with fintechs of different shapes and sizes who are coming up the maturity curve themselves. So what advice do you give them?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I'll just echo my co-panelists here on a couple points, but maybe first, it does start and end with trust. In financial services, if you're a fintech, if you're a big bank, you know, if you're the regulator, we've got to cultivate trust, and that's where it's really got to start. You know, you said I had a squazillion dollar budget. I wish, but
Might be off.
But I'll say at CBA, it's a team sport. We do spend $900 million a year on these various protections, from cyber through to fraud to scams, et cetera. And you know, that's a lot of money. It is a team sport internally to spend this sort of money and to drive that sort of investment into the ecosystem. But also, it's a team sport once we get outside of the walls of Combank. We could do a lot internally. Where we're at our best is when we're working with the ecosystem. So Mel talked about knowledge sharing. That's important. We have here in Australia AFCX, which brings that up a level to actually coordinate on, you know, where the trouble is and how to recover more rapidly. CBA and some of the other banks down here are participating in a world first with this, which is this thing called BioCatch Trust, which is now sharing biometric markers on the device on both sides of the payment, which means we can bring more safety to any end-to-end interaction. I mean, these are, I think, like, for a reason world first, because they're hard, but also they're really important world first. And the teamwork aspect is really critical. And that's where I think the government's got it right. Like, if you look at the SPF, it's really ambitious. So this is coming sometime next year, let's say. And the SPF recognizes the ecosystem. It recognizes we can all play a part. And it seeks to set the framework and the regulatory fabric in such a way that we're all encouraged to work together. I think that's really beautiful. You know, we start with ADIs, telcos, and some of the social platforms. I think if you're in the fintech community, you'll notice that you're not on that list right now, but that's going to come right together with Treasury's strategic plan on payments, where, you know, we've come through the initial report, we've come through some of the other reforms. PSRA has now passed on the 3rd of September, and next cab off the rank is licensing. And so I'd expect that, you know, as we have more regulatory clarity, we have a better framework for expectations. That's going to bring trust into the fintechs in a stronger way for all of our consumers. But also, it's going to mean that we can really recognize the full ecosystem, and we can all kind of benefit from the same joint assets and collaboration to fight the bad guys. I mean, that's the really critical thing. And that hopefully will land us at a place where we can earn the trust of all of the end users of the payment system.
It might be fun to pull that thread a little bit, and we're kind of starting to talk about the way things may change in the future, and in particular, you know, the SPF, it's really just finding its feet, and its full force is going to be felt in due course. And if I reflect 3 years previous, if we were on the stage talking about the topic of scams, we'd be saying some very different things. There'd be alarming statistics in the multiple billions of dollars. And what you find 3 years on is innovation has worked. The leadership of government is starting to take effect. The private innovation that we see through organizations like yourselves is starting to have an effect. And so if we now replay today 3 years forward, I'd love to hear your perspectives on what we'd like to be saying in a room like this in 3 years' time once some of those things have started to come more into play. And Ethan, maybe I'll pick on you again and see if you wanted to start with a reaction to that conversation.
Well, I mean, I think the aspiration is zero. Like, it'd be amazing to have, the best possible experiences in zero risk. I mean, I think that that's probably unlikely. But I do think that Australia can set the edge for the world on how we find this balance and we drive the best possible outcomes for the end users. So, I would hope in 3 years' time that we have some real successes to celebrate. We can talk more about how rapidly we're jumping on some of the new risks, and we have more people looking to Australia to say, how do we do that too? So this conference, maybe in 3 years' time, we have an even more diverse international audience that's coming here to learn, and that I think would be a really incredible success.
Mel?
Two things. One, picking up Ethan's thread on the AFCX, we are currently sending scam text messages that we identify into the anti-scam intelligence loop. Picking up my earlier point of fragmentation leaving gaps for us, I would love to see that ecosystems and utilities like that have really worked and that we've all come together as one big happy family and hopefully got those scams down to zero. I think things like that are really early threads, and I absolutely hope that some of those innovations are the kind of things that we're talking about in 3 years as being really successful, and I'm sure many more that we haven't yet thought of. The other thing then from the consumer perspective, and the really awesome thing about being in my space, of course, is that we're all people, we're all customers. I'm a real customer and I really care about this product for the protection of myself and my family, and it's still a minefield. Hopefully some of you in the audience find this product interesting, but you are probably not going to download a 200th app on your phone. I hope that in 3 years' time, this stuff is embedded, it's frictionless, it works in the background, and we all have that guaranteed protection from scams and fraud.
I really liked Ethan's comment on the idea of being part of a team, right? You're a team in your organization, whether it's a fintech or a bank, but then really industry-wide, as sort of Melanie mentioned, we should be aiming for, and this may sound a bit pompous, but in the last 30 years, the amount of fraud has basically continually increased. Now, notwithstanding sort of local statistics around fraud and scam protection in Australia, but globally it continues to increase. One of the statistics I'm always talking about is the amount of money that's laundered through the financial system. So when I started in this industry in the mid-90s doing some work for the Fed in New York, I had hair, and the amount of money that was laundered through the system was around 2 to 5% of global GDP. Fast forward 30 years, what is it now? 2 to 5% of global GDP, notwithstanding the billions of dollars that have been spent on fighting these particular nefarious activities. We can do better than that. We're at an inflection point, and with that type of teamwork that Ethan mentioned, that's our opportunity to realize a vision in 3 years that Melanie mentioned with no scams and no money laundered. Now, it's a bit of a noble and maybe sort of naive goal, but you might as well aspire to something like that.
Wonderful. We're coming up to our last minute. We might have time for just one audience question if anybody has something on their mind. Otherwise, I've got one more up my sleeve. Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. You spoke quite a bit about the Australian Financial Crimes Exchange. I was wondering if you have views on other industry efforts globally on information sharing to fight scams, especially products such as a global signal exchange that's run by the DNS Foundation.
I have to say I don't have specific familiarity, but I think this is the theme you're pushing on, which is we do have to have globalization of this coordination, I think is really important. So we have some local assets, we have some commercial assets, more global assets will be beneficial. And then I think regulatory harmonization as well for recovery of funds and for chasing down the criminals will be equally critical. So I do think that the next frontier is really how we line up for a global team sport instead of just a domestic one.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, a fantastic point, right? How many organisations are there here that are facilitating the global cross-border transfer of value, right? And what do we see? Do you think the cyber criminals are worried about sort of jurisdictional limitations in their business? No. Transnational crime's worth around $1.6 trillion in terms of annual revenue to organised crime groups. We need to operate collectively and as a global force against these criminal activities.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question, and please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you.